Shell, a shell. Over the next few weeks, the Americans continued moving closer to Yorktown. The men dug trenches and dirt walls to protect themselves from British cannons. For the American soldiers, the biggest danger came from British shells, or bombs that land in the dirt, sit still for a few seconds, and then explode, sending scraps of metal flying in all directions. As a precaution, Washington ordered his men to yell, a shell, whenever they spotted one of these bombs flying into camp. This led to a heated debate between General Henry Knox and Alexander Hamilton. Knox thought the order made sense. Washington was looking out for the lives of his men. But Hamilton was eager to prove his manhood. He claimed it was unsoldierlike, kind of wimpy in other words, to cry shell every time a bomb landed nearby. As the two men argued back and forth, two shells screamed down from the sky and smacked the ground near their feet. A shell, shouted soldiers. Knox, Hamilton, and everyone else dove for cover. But Hamilton didn't feel quite safe enough behind the dirt wall. He crawled behind the much larger Knox. Knox was about 6'3", 280 pounds, and held onto Knox's thick chest for dear life. After the shells had exploded harmlessly, Knox stood up, straightened out his uniform, looked down at his young friend, and said, "Now what do you think, Mr. Hamilton, about crying shell? But let me tell you not to make a breastwork of me again." The White Handkerchief. Nothing nearly this funny was happening in Cornwallis's camp. "We get terrible provisions now," said one miserable British soldier in Yorktown. "Putrid meat and wormy biscuits that have spoiled on the ships. Many of the men have taken sick here." In early October, Washington started to see dead horses floating in the York River outside the British camp. The meaning was clear. The British didn't even have enough food left to feed their animals. Sensing that victory was near, the Americans and French kept bombing Yorktown day and night. Then on the morning of October 17th, a teenage British drummer, came out of Yorktown beating his drum. The Americans couldn't hear the drum over the sound of exploding cannonballs, but behind the drummer boy, they saw a British officer waving a white handkerchief. Cornwallis was ready to surrender. The world turned upside down. The official surrender took place on the afternoon of October 19, 1781. Altogether, 7,247 British and German soldiers marched out of Yorktown and threw down their guns. They really threw them down. They were trying to break them so the Americans couldn't be able to use them. The British officers in general behaved like boys who had been whipped at school. Remembered one New Jersey soldier. Some bit their lips, some pouted, some others cried. A British marching band played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down," and upside down is exactly how Charles Cornwallis felt on October 19th. In fact, he was so upset by his defeat that he sent a message to Washington saying he was too sick to come to the surrender ceremony. When Cornwallis finally did meet the Americans a few days later, he was in for one final shock. There in the American camp, proudly wearing his American uniform, was Cornwallis's trusted waiter, James Armistead. "It is all over." Washington wrote a quick note to Congress telling them the big news. "I have the honor to inform you, Congress," he began, "that a reduction of the British Army under the command of Lord Cornwallis is most happily effected." The news spread quickly, sparking celebrations from Georgia to New Hampshire. The reaction was quite different in London. When the Yorktown news arrived in late November, it struck Lord Frederick North like a bullet to the chest. "Remember, this is the guy who at once so boldly declared, 'America must fear you before she can love you.' Now he started pacing up and down the room, waving his arms wildly and shouting, 'Oh God, it is all over.'" King George didn't agree. "I have no doubt," he wrote, "that when men are a little recovered from the shock felt by the bad news, they will then find the necessity of carrying on the war." When it came obvious to the king that he was the only person on the planet who felt this way, he got so depressed that he actually tried to give up his crown. He wrote a letter to Parliament saying, "His Majesty, therefore, with much sorrow, finds he can be no further utility to his native country, which drives him to the painful step of quitting it forever." George's friends talked him out of his rash decision, and the king finally accepted the fact that the United States had won its independence. Peace talks began, Ben Franklin and John Adams, still driving each other crazy, represented the Americans. One last story. The peace talks took 2 years, and during this time there were a few more small battles in the United States, and it was at this time that one of the American Revolution's most famous soldiers joined the army under the name of Robert Shutterleff. Who, what made Robert famous? Robert's real name was Deborah Sampson. Sampson grew up as an apprentice on a Massachusetts farm, plowing fields, chopping wood, stacking hay. She was tall and strong and eager for adventure. In the spring of 1782, she tied her hair back, put on men's clothing, and enlisted in the Continental Army. She was given a uniform, a musket, ammunition, and a knapsack. No one knew she was a woman. In a small battle that year, Sampson was cut on the head by a sword, then shot in the thigh. Covered with blood, she was carried to the hospital when a doctor bandaged her head wound, but Sampson didn't want the doctor to inspect her too carefully, even though she was thinking about keeping her secret. Even now, she was thinking about keeping her secret. So she grabbed a knife and a bandage and limped out of the hospital. Out in the woods, she sat on a fallen log and calmly cut the musket ball out of her own leg. I found that the ball had penetrated my thigh about 2 inches, and the wound was still moderately bleeding. At the third attempt, I extracted the ball. She bandaged the wound and hurried back to the army. Soon after, she came down with a terrible fever and was back in the hospital. Too weak to eat, drink, or even move, she lay flat on her bed for days. In fact, other soldiers were pretty sure she was dead. They started arguing over who would get her clothes and boots. She had just enough strength left to signal for the doctor. He bent over to inspect the patient, and this is where Sampson's secret was discovered. But the doctor told no one, and when Sampson recovered, she once again returned to the army. This is goodbye. The American Revolution officially ended September 3rd, 1783, with the signing of the peace treaty in Paris. Now everyone, even King George, had to admit the United States was a free, independent country. All over the country, American soldiers started heading home. Deborah Sampson took off her army uniform, put on women's clothes, and walked through camp. No one recognized her. Joseph Plum Martin, now 23, had dreamed of this day for years, but now that it was here, he wasn't quite sure how to feel. I can't assure the reader that there was as much sorrow as joy, he wrote. He had lived through as a family of brothers for several years. George Washington and his officers felt the same mixed emotions when they got together one last time at Francis's Tavern in New York City. The general lifted his drink in the air and said, "With a heart full of love and gratitude, I now take leave of you. I most devoutly wish that your latter days be as prosperous and happy as your former ones have been glorious and honorable." Then he asked each of his companions to come up and shake his hand. Henry Knox, who was nearest, stepped up to Washington, took him by the hand. The room was silent. Everyone in the place was trying desperately to keep his emotions under control. But it was no use. General Knox was the first to crack. Knox burst into tears and grabbed Washington in a big bear hug. Then all the other officers, tears streaming down their cheeks, lined up to hug their commander. "Such a scene of sorrow and weeping I had never before witnessed," said Benjamin Talmadge. Later that afternoon, Washington dried his eyes, left the tavern, walked down the street to the wharf, and stepped onto a waiting boat. He turned and waved his hat to his friends as his boat rowed away from shore. Washington stopped by Indianapolis, Maryland, where Congress was now meeting, to officially resign as commander of the Continental Army. "Having now finished the work assigned me," he told the members of Congress, "I retire from the great theater of action." Then he traveled home to Virginia to enjoy a peaceful retirement with Martha at Mount Vernon. That's what he thought, anyway. Whatever happened to Abigail Williams? Always her husband's closest friend and advisor, Abigail Williams continued offering her political opinions while John Adams served as vice president and then president of the United States. Some powerful men didn't appreciate Abigail's open participation in politics, but that never stopped her. What she When she neared death in 1818, John Adams described Abigail this way: "The whole of her life has been filled up with doing good." John Adams. John Adams served as American minister to Great Britain after the Revolution. Actually meeting his old enemy King George III, it was a short, polite meeting. Following one term as president, Adams ran for re-election in 1800 and was beaten by Thomas Jefferson, America's first truly nasty presidential campaign. Adams retired to his farm in Massachusetts, later calling these years at home with Abigail the happiest of my life. He died at age 90 on July 4, 1826. Samuel Adams. After dedicating his entire life to the struggle for American independence, Samuel Adams returned to Boston and ran for the House of Representatives in the country's first congressional election. He lost to a 31-year-old, still not ready to leave politics and too poor to retire. Adams turned to state government. He was elected governor of Massachusetts at the age of 71. The $2,500 salary was by far the highest he had ever earned. Ethan Allen. When American forces prepared to attack the British in Canada in late 1775, Ethan Allen was sent ahead to enlist Canadian volunteers. Instead, for some reason, he tried to capture the city of Montreal by himself. Sent to Britain in chains, Allen was later freed in a prisoner of war exchange. He settled in his beloved Vermont, where he died in 1789. James Ormsted. After risking his life as a spy during the Revolution, James Ormsted returned to the plantation of his owner. He remained enslaved until his former commander, Marquis de Lafayette, petitioned in the Virginia Assembly to grant his freedom, which it did in 1787. 40 years later, when Lafayette was visiting the United States, the two friends met on the streets in Richmond, Virginia. They hugged. Benedict Arnold. As a brand new British general, Benedict Arnold led several attacks on American towns, even raiding and burning New London, Connecticut, just a few miles from his boyhood home. After the war, Arnold moved restlessly between Canada, the Caribbean, and Britain, dying quietly in London at the age of 60. Poor General Arnold was departed this world without notice, reported the London Post. Peggy Arnold, with her husband till the end, died 3 years later at the age of 44. Gentleman Johnny Burgundy. Gentleman Johnny Burgundy retired from the British Army in 1784, turning instead to his true passions, playwriting and fine London living. He wrote several plays, including the comedy The Heiress, which was a smash hit in 1786. He died 6 years later at the age of 70. Charles Cornwallis. Back in Britain, Charles Cornwallis joined the massive public debate about who was to blame for Yorktown. His choice, fellow General Henry Clinton, Cornwallis later went on to serve successfully as military governor of British colonies in India and Ireland. He'd be sorry to see that he is sometimes still referred to as the man who lost America. Benjamin Franklin. Much to the regret of the women in Paris, Benjamin Franklin sailed back to America in 1785. Welcomed home as a hero in Philadelphia, he was soon asked to represent Pennsylvania at the Constitutional Convention. He is 82 years old, said a fellow delegate, and possesses an activity of mind equal to a youth of 25. After convincing many reluctant leaders to sign the completed Constitution, Franklin still wasn't done. He spent his final years serving as president of the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery. King George III. Shortly after the Revolution, King George III, age 50, began to suffer from a mysterious illness that doctors now believe to have been porphyria. He experienced intense stomach pain, rashes, confusion, episodes of what witnesses described as madness. For instance, one night at dinner, he attempted to smash the Prince of Wales's head against the wall. In spite of the work of ignorant doctors, the king's health improved. He continued to suffer similar attacks until his death in 1820 at the age of 81. Alexander Hamilton. George Washington's young aide, Alexander Hamilton, went on to become one of the main architects of the new American government and economy. Some historians say he was the most brilliant of all the founders, which is really saying something. But the way he died was not so smart. Caught up in a bitter feud between Vice President Aaron Burr, He agreed to duel Burr with pistols. Hamilton was shot and killed in 1804 at the age of 47. John Hancock. John Hancock remained the most popular politician in Massachusetts throughout his entire life, serving 9 terms as governor. As he grew older, painful attacks of gout swelled his joints and left him unable to walk. When Massachusetts was debating ratification of the Constitution, however, and it looked like the state leaders might vote no, Hancock got involved. He wrapped his aching leg in blankets, had himself carried into the meeting house, and announced, "I give my assent to the Constitution." Massachusetts approved the Constitution in a very close vote. By the way, you'll recall that on the night of Paul Revere's famous ride, young Dorothy Quincy said of her fiancé, John Hancock, "At that time I should have been very glad to have gotten rid of him." Dorothy and John were married in August 1775. They lived happily together until John's death in 1793. Patrick Henry, after serving in the Virginia legislature and as a state governor, Patrick Henry retired from government in 1791. Heavily in debt, Henry revived his old legal practice and his reputation as the most exciting courtroom lawyer in the country. One reason he had to keep making money was that he continued fathering children into his 60s. In 1798, his second wife, Dorothea, gave birth to Henry's 17th child. Henry died the next year at the age of 63. Thomas Jefferson, after serving as the country's first Secretary of State, second Vice President, and third President, Thomas Jefferson began a busy retirement at Monticello, his Virginia home. In addition to designing buildings and founding the University of Virginia, Jefferson made peace with the old political rival John Adams. Jefferson and Adams exchanged more than 150 letters discussing current events, political philosophy, and the hardships of growing old. Jefferson, like Adams, died on July 4, 1826, exactly 50 years from the day their Declaration of Independence was approved. Henry Knox. Before the Revolution, he ran a bookstore, but by the end of the war, Henry Knox was one of the country's top military experts. Knox served 10 years as the first Secretary of War before retiring with his wife, Lucy, to a mansion in Maine. Always known as great entertainers, Henry and Lucy immediately won over the new neighbors by inviting more than 500 of them to a massive 4th of July festival. Marquis de Lafayette. Marie Jean-Paul Joseph Rochevez Gilbert de Motier, also known as Marquis de Lafayette, returned to a hero's welcome in France. He was an early leader of the French Revolution. Then, due to events much too complicated to explain here, he led France and wound up spending 6 years in an Austrian prison. 30 years later, he made one last tour of the United States. He was greeted like a rock star. Joseph Plum Morton. After leaving the Continental Army, Joseph Plum Morton spent a year teaching in New York, then settled in Maine. He married, had a large family, and at the age of 70 published a book called A Narrative of a Revolutionary Soldier, Some of the Adventures, Dangers, and Sufferings of Joseph Plum Morton. Morton's book gives us one of the best inside looks at life in the Continental Army. Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine continued writing and traveling and offending others with his opinions. After nearly being jailed in Britain and nearly getting beheaded in France during the French Revolution, Paine died penniless in New York City in 1809. His death went unnoticed, except by a British admirer who secretly dug up Paine's bones and put them on a boat to Britain. No one knows what happened to them. Paul Revere. Returning to private life after the war, Paul Revere ran a hardware store, made bells and cannons, and continued his work as a master silversmith. As always, he was ready to drop everything to protect his town. When it looked like the British was about to attack Boston during the War of 1812, Revere grabbed the shovel and wheelbarrow and helped fortify the city. He was 80 years old. Deborah Sampson married a man named Benjamin Gannett and had 3 children. In addition to teaching school, she developed a traveling show in which she appeared on stage dressed as a Continental Army soldier and talked about her war experiences. When she died at the age of 67, Congress awarded her family a special pension for the relief of the heirs of Derrick Gannett, a soldier of the Revolution. George Washington? George Washington's hopes for a quiet retirement at Mount Vernon were short lived. First, he was sent to represent Virginia at the Constitutional Convention. Then he was chosen to be the first President of the United States. I greatly fear that my countrymen will expect too much from me, he confided in a friend. He served 2 terms as president, then he asked to serve a third. He absolutely refused. George and Martha Washington finally moved back home in 1797, where 2.5 years later, George Washington developed a dangerous throat infection. With no idea how to cure this kind of illness, doctors bled him 4 times and smeared a medicine of dried beetles on his neck. Washington could tell it wasn't working. I feel myself going, he told the doctors. I thank you for your attentions, but I pray to you take no more trouble about me. Sitting with him as he died, Martha called out, I shall soon follow him. Martha died 3 years later and was buried next to George at Mount Vernon.